You're listening to A Climate Change. This is Matt Matern, your host, and I've got two great guests from the Utah Rivers Council. Zachary Frankel, who's the executive director, founded the organization in 1994. He's an expert on water policy in Utah. His passion is protecting Utah's rivers. And we've also got Nick Halberg, who's a research and policy analyst at the Utah Rivers Council. His expertise is in water policy, hydrology, to economics. So welcome, gentlemen, to the program.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, we're excited to be here. Thank you.
So, Zach, let me just begin with you as to tell us a little bit about your journey and what had you found the Utah Rivers Council, and what type of work does the Utah Rivers Council do?
Sure. Thank you for the chance to speak to that. Looking back at my life, the thing that I have learned somewhat late in life is that water itself has been a really key and central component of my whole life journey. Some of my very first memory was actually underwater in a swimming pool. When I just was sitting at the bottom of a pool, looking at the water and listening and all the sensations of what it's like to have the sun reflect and bounce off of everything. And I just sat there really amazed. It's really my first memory, which was interrupted by a total stranger jumping in to, quote unquote, save me from drowning. And so, over time, as I grew up, I really had a proclivity and interest for water itself, and raised in a household with a keen interest in politics. That evolved into an interest in water policy and how we in the United States treat our rivers, streams, and lakes, and the major problems and emissions in American water policy, and recognizing the importance of freshwater ecosystems. So in the 1990s, I worked with some volunteer board members, and we started the Utah Rivers Council, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that works to protect our streams and rivers, recognizing the prominent importance in freshwater in supporting fish and wildlife species. And we're still working to educate Americans about how important our rivers are to the wonderful wildlife legacy that we have inherited from previous generations.
So tell us a little bit about what was the first project that you worked on as the director there.
One of our first campaigns was a proposal to, it was a proposed dam, a 260-foot high dam that was being proposed on a tributary here along the mountains, which in the Wasatch Front is the mountains that abut the Salt Lake Valley metropolitan area. And within these mountains is this wonderful stream called the Diamond Fork River that is home to about 160 different species of fish and wildlife, that was slated for a 260-foot high dam that would have inundated 3 miles of this river, including a very popular natural hot springs area. It was really popular with hikers and bathers. And so that was our first real campaign to get involved. So we worked with city councils and other elected officials around the Salt Lake Valley to start a grassroots effort to oppose that project. And after 2.5 years of hard work, we succeeded. And the dam was called off by its federal proponent, the Central Utah Water District, which is the largest water agency in the state of Utah, finishing the Central Utah project. So that really taught us that even here in conservative Utah, we can rely upon Americans to recognize the value of fresh-flowing, free-flowing streams and rivers for the importance of fish and wildlife habitat.
Well, tell us a little bit about, maybe this is related to the Great Salt Lake, and I've read about kind of challenges and crisis that was occurring with that lake going down every year. Was that river, the Diamond Fork River part, was it going into the Great Salt Lake, or?
Yes, virtually all of northern Utah is within that same watershed, the Great Salt Lake Basin. So the rivers that drain our mountains in northern Utah flow into, in northwestern Utah, flow into the Great Salt Lake. And the Great Salt Lake is the largest remaining wetland ecosystem in the American West. And it is a very, very important ecosystem for that reason. It has an incredible population of migratory birds that rely upon the Great Salt Lake. So we're talking about 10 million individual birds across more than 330 migratory bird species, traveling from every country in the Americas that stop over on the shores of the Great Salt Lake to rest and refuel themselves in these global migrations. We have some species gathering on the shores of the lake in larger numbers than anywhere else on the planet. And so, as you mentioned, Matt, what the Americans and people from across the globe have been looking into Utah for is this disconcerting news that the Great Salt Lake is in a crisis from shrinking water levels from these tributaries that it's depended on coming out of the mountains that are shrinking down and making the lake set a record low level just 2 summers ago. And its future is very uncertain because of the decline in water entering the lake shores.
So what do you see as a way to kind of save the Great Salt Lake and kind of other areas that are similar to it around the state of Utah and probably around the American Southwest?
Well, that's a really important question. It's like one of the most important questions in my mind in water. You know, what's happening inside Utah is happening all across America. It's just that Utah has the most obvious and exaggerated example of that. And by that, I mean, many people are surprised to learn that Utah is America's highest #1 per person municipal water user. In the United States, we're using about 75% of the water in Utah cities on grass. And that is creating a really impacting legacy on the Great Salt Lake because we are diverting the upstream tributaries upstream, obviously, of the Great Salt Lake, and we're shrinking it down because we're using too much water in our cities. And of course, because 80% of the water we use in Utah is for flood irrigating agriculture, primarily alfalfa hay. And so these upstream water diversions in our cities and in our farms are shrinking down what is left for the Great Salt Lake. And the Great Salt Lake doesn't really have any protection. It doesn't have any rights. It doesn't have a solid, proactive network of policies that are necessary to be implemented to save it for future generations of obviously migratory birds and the other many benefits that come from a healthy and sustainable Great Salt Lake. And just to wrap up that piece, you know, we as Americans have been programmed into believing we're on the verge of running out of water. And that is, you know, certainly there are many, many communities that are at the limits of their water supply in the United States. Yet we're still failing as Americans to have a real honest conversation with ourselves about how we value water, or by extension, don't properly value water, and how we use water so wastefully. We treat water like it really doesn't matter. And our grass landscapes in our cities, for example, you know, they're not really contributing substantially to our economy or our quality of life. That oftentimes is just decoration. And so it's easy to forget that this water is literally essential to a range of fish and wildlife species outside of our cities that, you know, we need to learn to coexist with.
Well, you've raised a number of great points there, Zachary, and I guess one of them is kind of the rights of nature, and that essentially our natural things like rivers and lakes don't have any rights under our current system of law, but there are certainly a lot of countries and places that are starting to initiate that process of giving lakes and rivers and rights to effectively protect them. And then another thing kind of related there to it is the growth in Utah, new development. I've read some articles about areas that are fast developing there, and there's just not enough water to really service those areas in the way that previously had done. And we've only got a little bit before the break, but maybe you can start answering that and we can talk about it after the break.
Excellent. I think we really want to be careful about how we value water. If we're burning dollar bills up on our driveway, we can't talk about we're running out of money, right? Because how we use our money is a function of that. And that's the point we're trying to make with water. If we get more conscientious about water and how we value it and how we use it, then I think there's actually plenty of water for a really sustainable economy.
Well, that's a great point. And we'll be right back in just 1 minute. You're listening to A Climate Change. I've got Zachary Frankel and Nick Halberg of the Utah Rivers Council, and we'll be right back in just 1 minute. You're listening to A Climate Change. This is Matt Matern, and I've got Zack Frankel and Nick Halberg on the program from the Utah Rivers Council. And Nick, just turning to you for a minute, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing and how did you come to the Utah Rivers Council?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the second question first. So when I was studying my undergrad, I was doing a lot of economics work, looking at how natural resources sort of form the base of a lot of the opportunities we have in society and the inequities, and how distributing those resources more in a better, more efficient, more equitable manner can help solve a lot of those problems. And then saw Zack give a talk at my college and got involved with Utah Rivers that way, and really quickly found out that water is sort of at the forefront of these things I was interested in. If we want to talk about, ensuring equal access to a basic human need and right, water, then we have to start looking at ways that we distribute that more equally. And I think with climate change, that starts to become a real problem. So for example, some of the things we've been working on at the URC to start to address that is looking at climate change in the Colorado River Basin. I'm sure many of your listeners are aware, and most Americans are aware of the crisis that's been happening in the Colorado River Basin. Really severe drought, the worst in 1,200 years, primarily a result of climate change and shrinking snowpacks and warmer air temperatures, and all the problems and issues that's causing. What we've sort of started to be trying to do is look at how does that water get split up as this river is shrinking. How do we live within our means? And we've done a lot of different work looking at different conservation techniques we can use to address that, but also where does the water in a smaller river go to? Who gets the water when there's less of it? How do we make sure it's going to the places that are going to be the most affected and everyone has this basic human right to survive in their communities?
Well, certainly those of us who live in California are somewhat dependent on Colorado River water. So it gets the attention of Californians to when we talk about this, and the heat wave that we've had over the last number of years. I think 19 of the 20th hottest years have been the last 20 years. So kind of unprecedented. Tell us a little bit more about the Colorado River and what steps are being taken to protect it from, protect its future.
Yeah, I think a good way to think about the Colorado River is a big shift in mindset that is occurring, needs to occur faster to adapt to the 21st century. So the 20th century in the Colorado River system is largely about building dams, storing water, taming the river, so to speak, and then building all this infrastructure to control this, huge river that's the lifeblood of the American Southwest, from all of us up in Salt Lake and the headwaters all the way down to LA, Mexico, down at the tail end of the river. And I think what we've seen since the turn of the century is a really distinct and clear signal that climate change is having a serious effect. We've seen flows in the river decline by about 20%. We've seen projections come out from very credible scientists showing that flows could be, decline another 20% in the future. We could be looking at a river with 9 or 10 million acre feet, whereas in the 20th century, we had a river of 15 million acre feet of water. So significant declines. And I think the question there is, how do we collectively, all 7 states who share in the Colorado River water and Mexico, come together to reduce our water use to live within our means? Now, it's a really contentious system. There's a lot of division between the upper basin and the lower basin and all these different things about use it or lose it. And this, 1922, 100-year-old compact that's governing how all of this stuff happens. But I think at the core of it is just understanding, look, there are places where we're not using water efficiently in the Colorado River Basin. There's places where water is leaking through dirt canals. There's places where it's being used wastefully to water lawns in cities. And it's really on all of us, those in the upper basin, in Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, those of us in the lower basin, to try to start reducing our water use, not just so we can catch up with the river where it is at now, but so we can prepare for an even hotter, drier future where the river is even lower. And I don't want to make this sound like too much of a doomsday scenario. I think this is a very achievable thing. A 10 or 11 million acre foot river is still a very livable future. We just have to prepare ourselves to get there.
Well, one of the things that I've read about is that there are farmers in California in really hot, dry areas down by Mexicali and El Centro in California that have water rights to more water than I think it was Arizona and Utah combined, and they're growing alfalfa down there, and it's just a tremendous. And then they're exporting it, so it's not even stuff that we're using here in the United States, so it's not required for us to eat or anything like that. So what about just paying those farmers off and saying, hey, we'll take your water rights back, we'll pay you a reasonable sum, and then we'll have a lot more water for everybody who's upstream.
Yeah, so I think that's the obvious short-term solution that everyone points to. It's hard to ignore the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is agriculture. Pretty much any mountain west community that uses water, it's likely that the vast majority of that water is going to be used for agriculture, and probably most of that for alfalfa, and probably a lot of that will get exported out somewhere else. And I think you can't look at the problems on the river and ignore agriculture and try to squeeze out all your solutions from just municipal water conservation. That said, it is because of the way the laws are set up, because of the way that all of this first in time, first in right, usually the farmers were the oldest, they have the most senior uses of that water. There's some programs designed to go in and try to buy water from those farms. The Bureau of Reclamation has been doing a lot of that with money that got appropriated from the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act. I think there's $4 billion that went to the Colorado River Basin to try to start addressing some of these things, specifically targeted some of those California farmers. But also, I think the thing that's, a huge opportunity sitting here is that a lot of the farmers operate with pretty low profit margins. They're using ditches that they're, at least in Utah, great-great-grandfathers dug by hand when they moved out and settled the state. So there's a lot of inefficient water use on farms. And there's a lot of programs we can set up. Utah's starting to do it. Oregon and Washington have had programs running for 20 or 40 years now that have been really successful in taking taxpayer funds, going to farmers, upgrading infrastructure on farms, improving irrigation efficiency. And then you can use some of that saved water and put it into a river, put it into a reservoir, give it to a city, do something with it that's a more beneficial use for the public. And the farmer, now that they have all this new technology, can actually increase their crop yields, keep farming where they're at. So there's a nice balance that can be struck here. There's a lot of water we can free up from the ag sector without having to put farms out of business, without having to buy them. And it's probably more cost effective in the long run as well.
Well, I understand that there are many different things that play into protecting the water, and some of them are, say, planting trees and protecting the habitat that surrounds our watersheds. What work are is your organization doing to forward that part of the puzzle?
Yeah, I can take a first crack, and Zach, I'll let you step in too. One of the, I guess, more fun programs that a lot of the times we work on policy issues, especially my job, it's reading lengthy documents and it's writing lengthy reports and it's occasionally testifying to committees and stuff like that. But one of the fun hands-on things we get to do is each year we run a really robust rain barrel program where I think last year we had over a dozen municipalities in Utah come together and partner with us. And we basically get these rain barrels, get them subsidized through the cities and hand them out to residents. So residents can use rainwater captured off their roof to water their lawns and gardens. So we don't have to use our treated, costly municipal water. We can reduce the use of that. And that's really key for us. Reducing municipal water use means we don't need to divert as much water out of our rivers and streams. More can stay there for fish and wildlife, recreation, people downstreams. So I think that's one of the really fun programs. And yeah, Zach has been around, forever doing all types of different on the ground things. So I'll pass it to you, Zach, if you want to add anything.
Thank you, Nick. I must say, every time I hear you speak, I am more and more proud of you and how brilliant you are and what a credit you are to the generations coming up that's got to solve all these problems. I think that what we as Americans often do is we focus on our supply. The conversation is almost always dominated by supply, and it's not just water. We talk about supplies almost constantly in our resource use, and we very rarely talk about the other side of the equation, which is demand, which is what Nick just alluded to, trying to reduce our water demand. And we are really in infantile steps here in Utah and largely across the United States. Many communities are way ahead of us in Utah, inside the United States, in saving water. But generally, the United States has really got to catch up with some of our other countries on this planet that have really, really recognized that water is precious and needs to be valued that way. So the first place is just in basic economics and not pricing water so cheap as to encourage water waste. Now, for example, the price of water in many communities inside Utah, in cities, is around $2 per 1,000 gallons. I know it's hard to hear those numbers and have any reference point, but by comparison in Los Angeles, the price of water is about $15 per 1,000 gallons. It depends on what volume you're using it at. The higher the volume, the more the water price goes up. Higher volumes, higher prices. But we're paying 1/7 the price of water here in Utah that is in Los Angeles, and that's one of the best opportunities to save water, is price it like it matters.
Well, that's brilliantly efficient and remarkably simple. So I hope we can start doing that. Let's continue this discussion after the break. You're listening to A Climate Change. I've got Zack Frankel and Nick Halberg on the program, both of Utah Rivers Council, and we'll be back in just 1 minute to talk about problems that we're facing all across the nation. You're listening to A Climate Change. This is Matt Matern, and I've got Zack Frankel and Nick Halberg on the program of the Utah Rivers Council, and we were talking about a lot of things, river policy, water policy in Utah and across the country. I was curious, there was a little bit of a controversy on this Bears Ears National Monument that was initially created by President Obama and then reduced by 85% by President Trump and then restored by President Biden. It sounds like a bit of a political football. What are the issues related to Bears Ears from a water policy standpoint, and how is it affected by being a national monument or not being a national monument?
Oh boy, the monument debacle inside Utah is really been, just as you described, it's been a political football back and forth that really, for us Utahns that really care about fish and wildlife species, about ancient sites, about both archaeological ruins and sacred sites to the indigenous tribes of Utah and the rest of the Southwest. It's really demonstrated how important it is that we have a strong federal policy to protect key lands and landscapes like this one. from outside Utah, because the opposition inside Utah to the national monument, a lot of it was driven by profiteering by individual interests inside Utah. Some of it was driven by special interests that are looking for contracts related to water. So Utah is home to the largest proposed new water diversion in the entire Colorado River Basin. And that's a much hated water project called the Lake Powell pipeline, which has received a lot of controversy and was initiated by the state of Utah in 2006. And the relationship to the monument with that is that it actually was slated to go through monument boundaries. And when the proponents, essentially the contractors and other interests that want to be paid to build that project, realized that the monument was creating headaches to the alignment of the pipeline through those lands, there's immediate opposition to that. And there was part of the effort to shrink down the monument and make it smaller, with several water districts being actively engaged in communicating their concerns about the monument to the federal government in a quest to shrink down the boundaries. So there was also concern about mining operations, future mining operations, and mining claims inside monument lands. And in general, there was just also a opposition to the federal government telling Utah what to do, but on the hands of really, I would say, a handful of elected officials locally in Utah who make a big deal in their campaigns to get reelected to the Utah State House about how the big bad federal government is against us poor Utahns and making it hard for us to make a living. And those would be my thoughts. And a really good question, Matt. Nick, I don't know if you've had anything to add to that.
I think that's great. I mean, the Bears Ears National Monument issue specifically is probably one of the first issues. I started college in 2016, so this was right at the forefront of this political football getting ready to get kicked back the other way, right? And it was one of the first issues that really, I think, brought me into the environmental movement, started to get me engaged in those issues. And I think Zack did a great job. We've seen the monument boundaries, a lot of cry over it's too big, but a lot of the stuff happening at the peripheries, boundaries being specifically carved out to make way for pipelines, all these other things that are going through, what are essentially still, very precious, protected, open, wild lands that the monument previously protected, all of a sudden getting carved down so a pipeline can go through. We should say that the Lake Powell pipeline has not been built. There is not a pipeline through the monument. We've been fighting that proposal for many years and will continue to do so. So good news on that front as of yet.
Well, you bring up something, Lake Powell situation is such that I think my understanding is that it's in pretty dire straits, and that Lake Powell has been shrinking in recent years, and the thought that it could become kind of like a dead lake. What are the prospects there, and what's being done to prevent that from occurring?
Yeah, let me take this one and I'll pass it to you in a moment, Nick. So Lake Powell is America's second largest reservoir. Lake Mead is the biggest in the country. So Lake Powell and both Lake Powell and Lake Mead have been shrinking as a function of climate change, warming up our winters, and therefore shrinking our snowpacks in the headwaters. The Colorado River is considered what's called an exotic river. You might have heard that reference in relationship to the Nile in Egypt. And it actually has a real scientific definition. It means that the origin of the water is very far away from its terminus, in this case, obviously, into the Pacific. And so what's happening is that climate change has been shrinking the headwaters of the Colorado River. And as it shrinks the snowpacks, that's where most of the water in the Colorado River is coming from. Snow melt runoff in the spring. And Glen Canyon Dam at Lake Powell was designed in an era absent climate change. The Bureau of Reclamation, when they designed the plumbing system of Glen Canyon Dam, they didn't really anticipate that there would be a long-term mega drought that would befall the American Southwest and obviously the Colorado River, which of course is what we are beginning to experience this century now, which is slated to continue probably for decades and decades to come. And so I mentioned that design problems because one of the biggest problems we've got as Lake Powell drops to lower and lower water levels because of climate change is that the plumbing system designed to deliver 7.5 million acre feet to the lower basin states of California, Arizona, and Nevada is in jeopardy. There is not the plumbing that takes the water from Lake Powell and passes it on the other side of the dam and obviously into the Grand Canyon is too high up in the dam's vertical column. It was designed to operate when Lake Powell is full or nearly full. And of course, now we're in an era, even though we had big headwater snowpacks this last winter, the Lake Powell is declining. And as it shrinks lower and lower down in elevation, that plumbing is too high up in the water column. And they're having to shift to another set of tubes that were never designed to deliver that 7.5 million acre feet to the lower basin. And it's only a matter of time before the dam is no longer functional to deliver the lower basin's water. And this is an issue that we at Utah Rivers Council, alongside our wonderful partners, Glen Canyon Institute and the Great Basin Water Network, we all co-authored this wonderful study to call upon Americans, especially in the lower basin states, to ask the federal government to retrofit Glen Canyon Dam to make sure that we can have water keep continuing to flow through the Grand Canyon and to the lower basin states and to Mexico, so that the lower basin residents can rely upon the water of the Colorado River as they have been, for some 101 years now.
Well, an aside here, a related comment. I recall that the Lake Powell was named after an explorer, naturalist who came out to examine that area in the Southwest and reported back to the federal government that they should never kind of try to develop the Southwest into a great big urban areas. And unfortunately, they didn't follow his advice and they named the big lake after him. So anyway, Nick,
it is ironic.
Yeah, jump in there as you will.
Yeah, just to put a fine point on what Zack said, there are massive long-term, large-scale issues in the Colorado River Basin, climate change and overuse. But I think if we're talking about the most acute crisis in the past, 2 years, I think it is Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell. In June 2022, we heard the Bureau of Reclamation's commissioner testify to Congress saying that the lower basin states need to be cut 2 to 4 million acre feet of water to avoid, catastrophic consequences in the system, basically. And what she was talking about was water levels at Lake Powell, was water levels getting too low, not being able to use the tubes the Bureau's used to relying on to pass water through and having to rely on those lower set of tubes Zack was talking about. There's been some very slow steps to start to address this. The lower basin states, to their credit, Nevada, California, Arizona, have repeatedly in multiple letters now told the Bureau they think it's very wise if we start looking at what can be done to address this problem. That means most likely re-engineering the dam in some capacity. There's some folks on this really great committee, one of the technical committees for the Bureau, who've raised the same issue. And sort of under pressure from them, the Bureau's done a very preliminary study to look at some of these things. But that study was completed, almost a year ago now. Very little follow-up on it and almost no action. So we really, are just not seeing people take this crisis as seriously as it is. Of course, it's not the long-term cause, but it is the acute point. Glen Canyon Dam is very quickly getting to the point where it's going to start to inhibit water flows into the Grand Canyon, into the lower basin. And, it's going to take years and years to put any retrofit in that we need. So I think we really need to start taking this issue much more seriously than we are.
Well, I appreciate you guys sounding the alarms here, and hopefully our listeners will start talking to their politician friends and starting to put some pressure to move the ball so that we can solve this problem, because there are millions of people who are relying upon this Colorado river water. So you're listening to A Climate Change. I've got Zack Frankel and Nick Halberg on the program. We'll be back in just 1 minute. You're listening to A Climate Change. This is Matt Matern, your host, and I've got two great guests on the program, Zack Frankel and Nick Halberg of the Utah Rivers Council. And, Zack and Nick, just talking about kind of why you two are in this and what your passion is. I know that both of you are kind of living in the solution. You're making changes and helping us get to a sustainable future. What does that look like for you? And maybe you could share with the listeners some things that they might do to get out there and be a part of the solution.
Yeah, wonderful question. And, one of the most important questions of our day is what can we do and how should we perceive this challenging future facing us? And, one of the things that I like to say in our work is that I want to win, and I'm kind of addicted to it. And so, we've been working at Utah Rivers Council. Our organization's been around for almost 3 decades now. And we've had a number of really important victories that really keep people at the table. We can succeed. And I think it's really easy to forget that. Part of what we do as communicators and activists is we have to communicate problems, because we can't implement a solution if nobody understands why we're doing it. So, we have to spend a fair amount of time talking about our problems, just as we have today. But that doesn't mean that we should be, paralyzed by the problem. There is so much room to succeed here. It's phenomenal. And we at Utah Rivers Council, for example, we have stopped 5 different proposals to build very destructive dams and water projects. And we've succeeded, not by pressing some hidden magic button, but just by applying ourselves and having a sense of purpose and hope. And that's what keeps people coming back into our door and working with us as staff, as volunteers, as partners, as allies among elected officials, is, hey, let's implement a better policy over this, that, and the other. We've written legislation that has become law in Utah. We wrote the first water conservation law in Utah, the Water Conservation Plan Act, which, I was a young man when I wrote that, and now it's become one of the fundamental municipal water conservation tools that all the cities of Utah use to plan their future conservation measures around water. And so, if a relatively dumb guy like I can do that and get it passed, then anybody, especially people that are much brighter than myself, like my esteemed colleague Nick here, Nick Halberg, we can do a lot. People like Nick are really going to take us to the next level as a community of activists and conservation leaders. So it's really important that people understand that they have much more power and much more ability to influence change than they've been taught. I think there's a lot of parts of the world that want to teach us that we don't have any power, but that's just fundamentally not true. We all have immense ability to influence the benefits that we can see coming to future generations around climate change policy and in the water sphere.
Well, I love that, and I think that's incredibly powerful, Zack, and something that needs to be said a lot more, which is we can do something and we can be powerful, particularly with sustained effort and focus. Tell us, Nick, about how you see the sustainable water future for Utah, the Southwest, going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that we're starting to see now, and hopefully with a lot of the people, I was born in 1998, right before this precipitous decline in Colorado River flow started happening. So more or less my entire life has been learning to live in a world with declining water flows and water shortages. And I was really freaked out at first. I had a lot of climate anxiety. One of the things that helped me out the most with that was Paul Hawkins' Project Drawdown, who I think was a recent guest of yours. So thank you to Paul and Project Drawdown. But I think once you get the solutions in front of you, it's easy to see that there's a lot of hope. And I've recently just come across many really innovative, cool programs that have been really inspiring to me. I mentioned one earlier in the podcast. Oregon and Washington doing programs where they're able to match up funding with farmers, improve irrigation efficiency, create these win-win outcomes. Farmers get better crop yields. They get to keep their water to continue staying in operation. They're more resistant to droughts and cutoffs. And then also, the public wins because they get more water in their rivers and streams for threatened and endangered fish species to meet future growth demands, all those types of things. There was another really cool, we were just at a conference in Las Vegas, sort of at least a nation leader, if not a world leader on water conservation efforts. There's a really cool program there where municipalities can go in, implement these really robust leak detection programs, find and fix all the leaks in their water system. And then some really, smart scientists and economists are working on a methodology to be able to track what reduction in pumping and power generation costs is that, since we're not pumping a bunch of leaking water into the ground. Our water supply is more efficient. We're using less water. We're reducing our pumping costs. That can turn into a carbon credit. And that credit can then be sold by these municipalities, and they can use that money to then go and purchase even more leak detection stuff and really hammer down this stuff. So I think there's a lot of really good virtuous cycles, a lot of smart people working on this to get that done. I think the biggest thing, maybe speaking as a younger person, someone who's seen a lot of this, is just get past the doom and gloom, get involved, start looking at the solutions. And once you start seeing them, then you'll see that there's more solutions out there than we, could possibly implement by one person alone. And it's going to take a bunch of us, and everyone can play a different part and do a different thing. And that can all help us get to a more sustainable water future, a future where we're considering water as a resource, a scarce resource that needs to be managed carefully, rather than just something that flows abundantly out of your tap anytime you touch it.
Well, that's great. And one of the things that I've been conscious of, or more conscious of, is doing this program for the last 3 years, is that there are just so many people out there, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people across the US, across the world, who are working on these problems every day and making great strides. And that it's amazing to see this great work being done. So it does give me a lot of optimism that so many incredibly talented people are doing the work. So to the listeners, hey, jump in and start working alongside these amazing leaders, and be a leader yourself too. So just kind of pivoting a little bit here, who would you put on your Mount Rushmore of your top 4 or 5 people for, in the climate change area, Zack?
Boy, that's a tough question. Of course, I'm a little older, so my leaders go back a little further. One of the people that I found so inspiring was Bill McKibben, the founder of the nonprofit 350.org. That was obviously a reference to carbon concentrations, trying to keep our carbon level to 350 parts per million, back when we were in the 200s. And so I think, I asked Bill, I met him several times, and I asked him once, Bill, like, how do you feel about this issue of climate change, when you get out of bed? And he's like, look, I pop out of bed, basically, and I'm applying myself, and I'm doing everything I can, and I feel really fulfilled about it. And I think that's the climate anxiety that people feel is from inaction. I think when people get active, suddenly that sense of desperation goes away because there's something to do, and they feel like, okay, I can keep working on this. And if you're hearing this podcast and you don't feel that sense, then, ask yourself, what is it that would make me feel, more useful to this cause? Because I promise, if you can follow that compass needle, it will be personally rewarding, not just what you quote unquote should do, but personally it'll be rewarding to you to be engaged and involved. And, you might end up hosting your own podcast, just like Matt here. You never know where things are going to lead. So that's what I'd say is really important. And then, going back even further, Brock Evans is one of the foremost conservation leaders that I had the luck and real gratitude to work with and meet. He was David Brower's first staff member they ever hired way back in the 1950s. He was an attorney from the Pacific Northwest who moved to Washington, D.C. He was in the White House when all the seminal environmental legislation was passed. mostly under the Nixon administration. So way back then, and Brock is a wonderful person. He's since retired to Oregon, but he's so positive and optimistic. And you might think someone who's been an environmental lobbyist for 5 decades, would be really cynical, especially in the halls of Congress. But he's so positive. And same with David Brower. Before David Brower passed, one of the real seminal leaders, the first real prominent leader at the Sierra Club that really took the organization to the next level. Before he passed, he had the same sense of optimism. So that's only 3 of your 4, but those would be my first 3 that really inspire me. That of course I'm standing on their backs as I work as a conservationist.
Well, I'll throw it over to you, Nick, and you can give us your 4 quickly, and then I'll wrap it up.
I'll just keep it quick. I think I mentioned Paul Hawken already. Project Drawdown was tremendously inspiring and uplifting to me, seeing all of the specific technical solutions, the actual building blocks to our path to a carbon neutral world. But one of the most impactful, people I probably listened to was Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, Alex Bloomberg. They also run a great podcast, How to Save a Planet. So after you've listened to the entire library of climate change, you can go check some of them out as well. I think when I was in my deepest throes of climate anxiety, those are some of the folks who helped pick me up out of there. And then also a lot of the young people in the Sunrise Movement, the leaders, and also just some of the other young activists. I think you saw with Joe Biden's presidential platform and the most progressive presidential climate policy, that has ever been enacted. I dedicate in large part to them, and I think the work they're doing is just fantastic.
Well, thank you both. It's been a pleasure having you both on the program, and everybody should check out the Utah Rivers Council and, either volunteer, give generously, the great work that they're doing. And thank you both, Zack and Nick, for being on the show. Everybody check out our website at climatechange.com. Follow us on Apple Music, Spotify, iHeartRadio, all the social media channels. Do the same for the Utah Rivers Council. Stay engaged, be the change you want to see in the world, everybody. And have a great week, and tune in next week.